Morning, everyone. What lesson is it? Brilliant. Um, Good to see so many of you online. Who have we got so far? Tanishka, Raoul, Capri, Lily, Ruby. Fantastic. So yeah, we are carrying on with ecology. This is the sixth lesson. It's probably the biggest science topic we've done so far, and there's lots of different aspects that sort of tie into this. Morning, Nico. Good to see you online as well. So yeah, we've as we're sort of going through, it ties into some of the chemistry. We've got a bit of physics coming in as well when we start looking at the greenhouse effect. So yeah, it's a huge topic, but we're pretty much getting to the end of it now as well. What I want to do today is I want to go through and have a look at, we need to have a quick look at deforestation and some farming methods. And I've got some exam questions as well that we're going to go through and have a quick look at how you might want to answer those. So we can sort of bring those in as well. If you remember back from last time round, we looked at biodiversity again, and then we looked at different ways, different types of pollution, different ways of damaging the earth. So we looked at damaging land, we looked at damaging water, and we looked at the air pollution. Morning, Grace. And we looked at the different ways we can do that, and then we started looking at some of the effects of that. And the reason I want to show you some of the exam questions for this is so that you can start to see that even in class we can't cover everything. All we can hope to try and do is cover as much as possible, and then allow you guys to use that common sense that, trust me, you do have, even though you don't believe it, to try and actually apply your science knowledge to slightly bigger scenarios. Okay, so we'll have a look at some of that as well. If you remember, we looked at land. We were looking at things like quarrying and building and farming. We looked at waste disposal, and we looked at the waste hierarchy that goes with it. And we said, actually, in terms of trying to save the environment, reducing the amount of rubbish we have is the most important. And then after that, trying to reuse it what we can, so that less of it goes to landfill, so we can try and save the environment that way. We looked at things like quarrying, and we said that actually digging up the land, not only does it look bad, but we're actually digging up lots of nature, we're reducing habitats, and ultimately we're reducing biodiversity. And the vast majority of what we've been looking at so far is actually the biodiversity is really important, because the bigger the biodiversity, the more resilient the food webs and the ecosystems are going to be to change. Whereas if we reduce that biodiversity, we take away that resilience, and we end up with more species likely to become endangered. We also spoke about peat bogs, and we said that actually in some areas where we've got very acidic and wet soil, that the conditions aren't suitable for decomposition. And remember that decomposition is by microorganisms. So those microorganisms are going to need warmth, they're going to need a certain amount of moisture, but not too much. They're going to need oxygen, and they're going to need the correct pH range for them. Whereas actually when we look at peat bogs, we're looking at very acidic, very low oxygen. So there's not that many microorganisms. So we end up with an area that's massively rich in nutrients, but it's not actually decomposing. But as soon as we dig it up to either burn it or use it in the gardens, it starts decaying again, and we start releasing that CO2 back into the atmosphere. And all of this will tie back into that carbon cycle, so we could add that into the carbon cycle that we drew the other day. So moving on, having a look at probably one of the more well-known topics, and that's sort of deforestation. Now, deforestation is exactly what it says in the title. It's literally looking at chopping down vast amounts of trees. Now, this could be rainforests, this could be other areas of woodland, but in other words, what we're doing is we're destroying the trees. And one of the problems we've got at the moment is, yes, we need that woodland, and we use the wood for quite a few different purposes. But one of the problems we've got is we're actually destroying the trees, chopping them down faster than we can actually grow new ones. So therefore, it's no longer sustainable. Sustainability is the idea that actually we can use the land, but we shouldn't be able to use it faster than it can recover, or that we can help it to recover. So a lot of companies nowadays are deliberately trying to plant trees to try and offset the carbon they produce, but also to try and reduce the amount of deforestation. I know there's been some areas in America where there's been huge, massive amounts of woodland that has been protected, and I know that Trump now has decided that he's going to reduce or overturn some of those protection orders to allow actually more quarrying, more mining, and more basically extraction of resources, which is going to have a huge effect on the earth if we're not careful. But unfortunately, he would rather actually put money or go for the money side of things rather than actually looking for the environment. But that's what happens when you get someone who doesn't understand and doesn't believe in science. So we're looking at deforestation. We need to look at some of the reasons why deforestation is happening. So in some areas we are looking at space. In some areas we're chopping it down to actually get the resources underground. So that might actually be things like quarrying. If you have a look at the sort of the Nahani and some of the national parks in Canada, there's massive, massive amounts of basically woodland, which is absolutely pristine, and it's sites of special scientific interest. So it's all protected, apart from one little tiny area in the middle where they've got roads going in, and there's a giant copper mine in the middle, because actually the copper is such a sought after resource that they actually lifted the restriction in that one particular area to mine the copper. So that's one of the areas that we can do quarrying for metals and also for rocks. Other things we're looking at is for cattle. So actually, when we're looking at companies like McDonald's, I don't know how this is in terms of recent, but there was a time when actually McDonald's was responsible for huge amounts of deforestation worldwide, and not just any forest. They were actually chopping down rainforest to produce land for their cattle. Okay, so actually, because they needed so much meat, they were actually then, like I said, clearing lots and lots of woodland, destroying huge amounts of habitats and ecosystems just so they can grow more cattle to feed the populations with their burgers. Morning, Michael. Good to see you online. Is your brother up yet? Rice fields. And actually other farming as well. So, cool. I didn't realise that. You have to tell me more about that, Capri, in the Q&A session if you can make it on straight after this. I'd be interested to hear what the recent evidence is in that one. But yeah, I know they've been responsible for quite a lot. So yeah, the other one is rice fields and farming as well. So lots and lots of forests have been chopped down to increase that we can actually grow more food. Now the problem with this, and I'm going to ignore McDonald's for a minute because I don't think that actually counts as proper food in any way, shape or form. But when we start looking at farming, one of the problems we've got is the population size. And I just want you to just keep that in mind for the moment, because actually when we go through and have a look in a minute at different farming styles and techniques, the population size is going to be absolutely key. Okay, so really, really quite important with that one. The other thing that we're doing is also not just sort of for food, but we've also been trying to increase biofuels. Now, we know that actually when we start going through and having a look at, we want to try and reduce the amount of petrols, oils and diesels. So one of the options to that is to actually use biological fuels. So that is things like ethanol, like the alcohol that we drink, we can also make in a purer format so that we can actually produce ethanol to run cars on. And it's a really, really cheap, simple conversion to actually put ethanol into petrol engines. I know when you go to some countries, and off the top of my head, I think it's Brazil, one of their laws is that all petrol you buy has to have at least 15% of a biofuel, such as ethanol, then actually being mixed into the petrol to try and reduce the amount that we're relying on fossil fuels. So one of the problems we've got with this one is actually if we want to produce more biofuels, then we actually need to grow crops that we can then ferment afterwards to turn into those biofuels, which means we need more land. So one of the other places that forestry has actually been, well, chopped down, rainforest and other forest, is so that we can actually grow more biofuels to run things like cars on. So in some respects, we're reducing the amount of fossil fuels that have been burning for fuels, but we're chopping down rainforest in order to produce it. So we've got to weigh up actually which one is the worst for the environment and which one do we need to actually try and sort out. Now, yes, we are looking at the moment at, we've got more electric cars and we're looking at other fuel sources, but the problem we've also got with that is although we can plug our car in maybe to, so for an electric car, plug it into the mains, But where does that energy come from? What's the initial fuel source for that? In some cases, it'll be a surplus of energy produced overnight. But actually, if we are still burning fossil fuels and biofuels to just power those electric cars, we're not really solving the long-term problem here. So that's something else that we need to have a look at. One of the things you will need to look at, and again, we'll look at some exam questions on this in a minute, is going to be evaluating the impact of these. So like I said, the difference between using fossil fuels such as oil to make petrol and diesel, is that better or worse than chopping down rainforests to grow crops so that we can make bioethanol to run the cars on? So what you would be expected to do is look at the advantages and the disadvantages of each of them. Guys, focus. Okay. Look at the advantages and the disadvantages of each of them. And if I was doing this in an exam, I would probably have basically 2 columns, advantages and disadvantages. I would go biofuels, I would go fossil fuels, and I would list those points for each of them. And then the key thing is put my own statement at the end. And your own statement cannot be wrong as long as you justify it with a reason for your opinion on that one. Okay? Yeah, the last thing I want to have to do, guys, is go through and basically hide your chat, which means you can still watch the video, but none of your comments show up for anyone if I go through and ban you from the chat block. So let's keep it on topic. Particularly as anyone who wants to ask questions means I'm going to miss any comments you say because it's going to disappear up in the chat. So let's just keep it on topic. Right, so what I'm going to look at now is go ahead through and have a look at some of the sort of food production methods. Bear with me. There we go. So let me just move that up to there. Just change colour so we can see it's a different section. So we're going to have a look at food production. Now, one of the problems we've got at the moment, and let me just find out what the latest world population figures are. So we can have a quick look at this one. It's quite a good website for this. If we just go in here, world population. So currently, as we stand at the moment, and we can actually go in and have a look a little bit more detail. Let's see if this is working today. So that's currently the world population estimate. Now, we can't go through and say, actually, we know this for certain, because realistically, we don't. Let's just get rid of some of those for a minute. We don't know for certain because a lot of it's estimates. When you look at some countries, they don't actually monitor the live births and the live deaths like we do in the UK. At the moment in the UK, pretty much every single birth and death is recorded. So we can actually say with a certain degree of accuracy. But when you go through and have a look at a lot of countries, it will be estimates. In some places, there'll be villages and towns that are too remote. And some places, they just do not have those sorts of statistics. So this is only an estimate. Now, I will have to at some point see if we can figure out and go back and actually have a look at past and present. So interestingly, the figure in 2000, which looked like it was around about 6 billion according to this, just over. I remember actually reading on the news at that time that we had just literally gone past the point at that point that the Earth could sustain naturally and organically in terms of food. So round about that 6 billion mark was what scientists said, as it stands for at the moment, that we can actually feed naturally. So bearing in mind, we now have gone back over that by about 2 billion past that. So we have a major issue when it comes to food. So we need to bear this in mind as we're going through and actually think about what can we do about that, and sort of link this into some of the ideas around farming nowadays as well. Why is the population going up? Well, actually, we have increased birth rates in most countries. Okay. We actually have better medicine in a lot of places. And due to science, we also have a higher average life expectancy. So when you start looking at all of these things and you start combining them, we've got this idea that actually people are living longer, they're surviving more. So in other words, actually we're going up, and the population as it stands at the moment is going up and up and up. Like I said, in most countries, I know countries such as Japan are predicted that over the next 25 to 30 years, unless things change, they're going to lose about a third of their population, because their birth rate, I'm sure I read last year, their birth rate was only about 1 million people through the whole of the country. And because people are living a lot longer, then actually their birth rate is actually less than the death rate over there as well. So they've got a real problem with their population declining in Japan. But with most places, it's just going up and up and up. So we need to sort of think about how can we try and sustain this many people. So one of the issues this causes is obviously food security. Now, in the UK, where we are, actually, food security isn't really an issue for most people. If you have the money to buy some food, then actually there will be food available. And actually, even if you don't, there are places to go. Generally speaking, people are not left to starve. There are some options out there for that. But you go across to some countries and actually they do not have the food to feed the population. So food security becomes a real issue. And what I want to just have a look at in this section of the topic is actually what things have been done to try and reduce food security and what things are we doing at the moment. Now, food security, we've also got issues with changing in diets. If you look at the Western world at the moment with the amount of obesity, one of the things we could actually do is get the diets back down to normal levels of where they should be. In other words, people eating more sustainable food in the right quantities. And actually, that will have a knock-on effect if you think about it, because it will reduce obesity. The problem with that, it will probably also increase life expectancy as well. So yes, we probably would start to look at the food issue, but it wouldn't resolve the population problems we've got at the moment, because people would just live even longer. So we've got that to think about as well. When we start looking at farming though, it's quite interesting, because actually one of the things that farmers have done for quite a few years is intensive farming. Now, intensive farming, if you think about, let's go for worst case scenario, and we look at battery hens, okay? And we'll just take this as a bit of a sort of case study and a bit of a, just to talk about for the moment. So if you think about battery hens, they are literally bred in cages that are very, very small for those chickens to live in. Now, lots and lots of people go, this is completely unethical. Personally, I agree, but that's just my personal opinion, because actually I think that anything that's alive, even if we're going to eat it at some point in the future, should have some quality of life. But when you look at the science behind this, you can understand why they do it. Because actually, by restricting movement, by providing warmer conditions, or actually, let me just get rid of that. Let's just say controlling their environmental conditions. In fact, we could even say controlling their ecosystem. What we do is we reduce their energy consumption. Okay? So we're dropping that energy consumption down. That means that we can actually get more of the food we give them. We can give them higher quality food. But we're going to get bigger animals, produce much faster because they're not burning off the energy and the calories. We can feed them higher quality food, which we don't need to give them as much of, so we can get more meat produced quicker, and we can also grow a lot more of them in a much smaller space. So if we just use the word yield here, we're going to get a higher yield from a smaller space and a lower cost. So actually, when we look at the intensive farming here, if we were just going on population and we were ignoring our sort of ethical issues, it makes a lot of sense to grow them in a restricted area where actually they're going to grow faster, there's going to be less energy expended, so it's going to be cheaper for the farmer, we're going to get more money back in return, and we're going to be able to feed more people. Now, the problem with this is ethically, yeah, I know, sorry about that. Ethically, there is lots of other issues here with this one. Also, if you go and have a look at barn, some people think the barn is better than free range, but generally speaking, that just means they don't even have the same space as they would have in the cages in battery farms, because with these they actually have their own unique space. But if you go to barn raised, they'll cram as many of them in as they can. They'll be just walking around in their waste. If any of them die or become ill, they just get trampled by the others, and ethically it's worse than this one. The other thing we'd have a look at as well is what some people have managed to start doing is if we start looking at free range. Yes, in an ideal circumstances, we get these images of the chickens and the hens being able to wander around, and then but actually, when we go down and actually have a look at it, all they need is maybe a couple of square feet outside the barn, which is caged off, so they have the ability to go out. So realistically, it's not always better, depending on where you get it from. Okay? Yeah, you can wait for D&D for that one, Capri. So, just be aware when we're looking at this one, you need to think about the ethics that are involved. Okay? So we've got, obviously, battery, which is cages. We've got barn. We've got free range. But it's worth looking at what are the issues with that one. If we went to what we consider proper free range, where actually they have lots of open space, they're not all crammed together, you wouldn't be able to fit many of them in the same space. I mean, if you think about battery, you can literally have rows of cages stacked upon each other. They all have the right amount of food, the right amount of water, the right amount of light, and the right amount of space. But they have no freedom in any way, shape, or form. So we need to be able to balance up the ethics between what's actually useful for this one. The other interesting thing is when we start buying cakes and biscuits and some foods that contain egg produce, most of those eggs come from batteries. If they don't, because it's cost effective for the manufacturers, a lot of the manufacturers would still go for battery, but they'd produce them in Europe and some other countries where maybe they don't have the same quality control that we do in the UK. So it's just worth being aware of these and doing the research beforehand, particularly when we're sort of starting to make the arguments, getting to debates about it. Okay, so we've looked at sort of intensive farming with that one. The other thing I want to sort of bring in with this one, we're still going to be looking at intensive farming, but we're going to be looking at fishing. And I'm going to show you an exam question on this in a minute, because actually there's been a real worry around the decreasing fish population due to overfishing. Now, fishermen have been going out with trawlers and with drag nets and gill nets, and they've literally just been sort of in the water and just capturing every single thing that swims into the nets. Now, one of the problems with that is it's completely sort of indiscriminate from the point of view that anything that goes in there, whether it's a dolphin, whether it's a whale, whether it's big fish, whether it's small fish, gets caught in and they get dragged on board. And to be fair, by the time they get sorted, they're dead anyway. So it's not a case of actually we can control what we get. So what they've tried to do is, some of the things they've looked at is they've changed the nets. Now in an exam, it's not good enough to say change the nets. Things they've done is they've made them smaller. So that's the overall size. But they've also increased the size of the gaps or the holes in the nets. And what that does is it means the smaller fish that maybe are too small to eat can actually get through the nets. They can carry on living, they can carry on growing, they can breed, and they can have new fish, and hopefully it reduces the population. Because otherwise what would happen is those fish would get dragged out. They wouldn't go into the food industry because they wouldn't be used for anything, so they're just destroyed. So by doing this one, we can try and reduce that as well. We do get intensive farming as well, which sounds really bizarre when you look at the thought of farming fish. But if you look at places like the north coast of Scotland, what they'll have is in the ocean, they will have these massive nets and they'll grow salmon. Now, they've still got the seawater going through, but it means actually they can't swim very far. So all of the things that we were just talking about up there in terms of ethics still goes out the window, but they still get the water, the natural water quality, but then they can actually control the feed. And one of the problems with farmed salmon is in order to make the meat look as good as wild salmon does, they will actually put colourings in the food to deliberately colour the meat. So they're not colouring it afterwards. What they're doing is colouring the food that the salmon eat, which then colours the tissue of them as they're growing to make the meat look better for us when we eat them. But it does mean we can grow fish with better quality food that costs less money. The fish grow faster and we get higher yields out of it. So that'd be another intensive farming technique that could be done that you would need to be aware of. Okay. Other things when we're looking at farming that we need to consider, actually pests. It's not always bad from the salmon, apart from the fact that the salmon, Lily, don't generally have a very good quality of life. In the same way that when we're growing hens in battery cages, people disagree with that one. With the salmon themselves, they're grown in these giant nets, they can't escape, and there'll be lots of them crammed into a very, very small space, so they don't have the space to actually swim around properly. Things they're also trying to do now as well, instead of the nets, is they're going to pole and line fishing, which is pretty much like fishing with a line. No, don't say sorry at all. It's actually a really good question to ask. It's basically, it's not, the food themselves is fine for the salmon, but the quality of life they have isn't as good. Pole and line fishing is one of the things they're saying to some fishermen to do, because that basically means if you catch anything that you shouldn't have, you can literally unhook it and throw it back in. So it's one way of trying to make sure that we only get the right type of fish and that we don't start catching species that are endangered. The problems with that is the catch levels goes massively down for the farmers, so the farmers don't make as much money, so they either need to put the cost of fish up or the farmers risk their livelihoods because they can't catch as much. So there's positives and negatives to all of these. Other issues we can have, pests and pathogens. That can decrease crop quality. If you think about the fact that in some areas of the world, you've only got to get basically a low level of water, so we can get a drought. Or we get a new insect come in that they haven't experienced before. Think about when I was talking the other day about the sort of cane beetles. Or we can get a new disease come in. I mean, we talk about COVID at the moment for us, but remember I was talking about things like the Dutch elm disease and the ash dieback in one of the sort of previous lessons. I think that was in Biology 3. But actually any crop or any food type, whether it's animal or plants, can still get new diseases. So if we get a new disease come in, that then is going to have a massive effect on those plants, which then reduces the yield quality, which means we can feed less people. So these are all the sorts of things that we might want to bring in. So pests, pathogens on that one as well. If you could, I mean, I suppose worst case scenario, I mean, if you go back, those of you that are doing history, I don't know if you study, those of you that are on the chat at the moment, when you study history, have you looked at the Irish potato famine and the effects it had when they weren't growing enough potatoes and the issues that came along with that one? Because you can actually look at similar things. If you can imagine, if America had an issue with their crops of grain, then actually that is a massive industry feeding worldwide. So if all of a sudden we couldn't grow the grain we needed, which many or most countries rely on, then that could also be an issue as well. It's something that's worth looking up of the impact. This is many years ago, but realistically, you'd only have to get a new disease come in and affect a crop as big as grain, and I think you'd have all sorts of issues with that one, and you would have mass famine, you would have mass starvation worldwide. Okay, so it's worth looking at as well. Cool. Let me just have a quick look through. I'm just going to put that down there because some of you might want to go and have a look. At some point and do a bit of research on that one. So it might be worth just having a quick look and just literally trying to figure out a little bit more around that later on, just so you can start to see some of the effects with that one. Other issues we might have, we know obviously about global warming, because I went through that last lesson. And actually, when we're looking at global warming, you've only got to try and have a look at some of the effects we had. So if we do look at an increase in temperature, if we might have a look at decrease in available water, if it affects the weather, then all of these would also affect the crops that are being produced and maybe affect the ability of certain areas to grow their own food and feed their population. So all of these issues could actually have some effect. Now, we'll just change to a different colour for a minute. We've spoken about sort of some of the things that we have done that might be positive. Polar line fishing, for instance, changing the nets, for instance. I know with fishing, they've also set quotas so that fishermen are only allowed to catch a certain amount. So once you reach that quota, you've got to stop fishing. And again, this is the idea that the fishermen then can actually make sure they only, because they set certain quotas for certain areas, we can try and let those fish levels recover. We obviously said intensive farming could be a benefit, but obviously you need to be able to talk about both sides of that one. Other things we can do, and we'll cover this a lot more when we look at genetics, but we can actually look at genetically modifying crops and animals to increase the yield. Now again, this comes with its own set of ethics that we need to consider, but actually if you can imagine if we did have a crop that came in that was maybe susceptible to a certain disease, technically we could try and genetically modify it to reduce how susceptible it is to water loss, to drought, to pests, and to pathogens. So we can have a look at that as well. One of the problems we've got with this farming, though, and I'm just going to put this down as a red, is intensive farming will often lead to a decrease in biodiversity. Because we are selecting the crops that we want to grow, we often will lose some of maybe the genes in the populations of the ones that weren't suitable, and some of those genes could actually give resistances that we don't have. So there's lots and lots of links here that's worth considering, that when we talk on the chat afterwards we may want to consider. So we've spoken about, let's go through and make sure we've done that one. Okay, something else just to bring in here. I'm going to put here transport. In actual fact, when we're looking at the effects on the world, the transport of food is quite big, because actually in a lot of cases we will import foods from all over the world that we could technically grow in the UK. It's absolutely sort of baffles me why we export a lot of lamb to New Zealand, but then we import New Zealand lamb back into the UK for us to eat. For me, that doesn't make any sense at all, but it's something to consider, bearing in mind how much land we've got, particularly in areas like Wales. So we need to think about things like that. In a lot of cases, we know that actually any time of the year, we want to go and get a certain type of fruit and vegetable. And pretty much if we go to a big supermarket, sort of Asda, Tesco's and some of the really, really big ones, we can pretty much get any food at any time of the year, even though it's currently not being grown in the UK at that time of the year. So we need to think about actually the effects of that. Should we be trying to eat more locally produced foods to reduce the transport, which means we then don't need to export and import as much and maybe sustain the land and the environment and the resources that we have in our areas? It might well be. What I have heard, Capri, and again, I don't know how true this is that it's interesting that the best, a lot of people say, oh yeah, British lamb doesn't taste as good, but they say the same thing about New Zealand lamb in New Zealand. And it often seems to be the case that the best quality lamb in the UK gets exported and the best quality lamb in New Zealand gets exported, rather than actually just thinking, why don't we just eat our own? So it's things like that that's worth considering. But transport is quite an issue that we do need to consider. So we need to think about what we can do. And there's lots of ideas that we can think about here, okay? So let's just sort of go around and have a look at some of these ideas, and we'll come back. I'm going to touch on some of the areas we've already looked at. Obviously, intensive farming. If we're just looking at feeding the population, we can intensively farm. But if it's animals, we need to look at the ethics behind that one. If we look at animals, then we've got the ethics. Plants, actually, do you know what? Intensively farm plants as much as we want to. It's not a problem at all. There is no ethics to worry about there. One of the ways that we can do this is hydroponics, which is where we literally grow plants in water, and those roots go into the water, and all of the nutrients, the water, everything the plants needs in the water. So we can grow vast amounts. We don't need soil. We can cram them in. We can grow them as much as we need to. Greenhouses have an effect here as well, because actually we can control the conditions. So we can put down here, okay, we can control the conditions, so we can set the temperature we need to, we can set water, we can increase CO2 if we need to, okay? So we can control the conditions as much as we need. The big problem with this one is obviously going to be space. I've seen in some places, you've got the idea, vertical farming. So yes, we said that Japan actually has a decreasing population, but if we go through and have a quick look at, let's go back to my world clock and let's just change this to vertical farming, and you look at some of the sort of options that people are coming up with now, then a lot of this is hydroponics. If you notice here, there's very little soil, there's lots of pipe work going around, but actually these plants are being grown in these sort of massive racks, and they can rotate them around as much as they need to. But rather than taking up land space, what we're doing is we're going up higher. We do need to make sure they still get the right amount of light, but it does start taking into account some of the issues we've got, where actually if the land is short, in the same way that we often build blocks of flats where you don't have enough land for houses, we can actually do the same thing with plants. Very, very scientific, and it's monitored in all sorts of steps of the way. But again, it's something else that you may want to do some research on when you're looking at it, because it does allow us to grow crops, more crops in the same amount of space. Okay, so just something to have a look at, maybe when you're doing some research for this, or when you're making your revision notes, it might be worth going through and including some of these when you're looking at it. Remember, when we're looking at intensive farming of animal, all of this comes down to reducing energy loss or energy transfer. Okay, so it's just something to be aware of there. And make sure that you can talk about the advantages and the disadvantages. We know, because we mentioned it before, we can genetically modify animals and plants. Again, this can make them more resilient. It can increase growing speed. We do have some ethical issues with that. And people are worried about, actually, if we start modifying genes, could we be causing other problems that we don't yet know about? But there is lots of... So if you research and Google golden rice is a genetically modified rice form that was grown to predominantly increase the food in areas where they couldn't grow enough and there was mass starvation. So that is one case study you can have a look at that was actually done. Not a food type, but something that has been genetically modified, that is being used daily by many, many people. Insulin is actually grown by genetically modified bacteria. So again, something to look at. Not all GM foods are bad. Okay, so just think about that. The other one that is quite interesting is mycoproteins. So this is a type of fungus called Fusarium. Now, this is not based on anything I've actually read or seen or anything else, but my personal opinion is I think this will probably end up being one of the solutions that we have in the future in terms of basically feeding lots more people. So mycoproteins is where you have basically a big nutrient vat, and you grow this fungus in there called Fusarium. Afterwards, you extract it, and you end up with basically a food produce that is pretty much zero carbs, zero fat, and very, very high in proteins and amino acids. We eat this now on huge quantities, and actually you'll know it as corn. So corn doesn't really have... Yeah, Fusarium is a fungus. I know there's a pasta that sounds very similar, so don't get it confused. But the Fusarium is a fungus. So corn generally has no taste to it. It takes on the taste of whatever you cook it with. So a lot of people say they don't like it, but actually the texture a lot of the time can be very similar to meat, depending on how it's cooked. And as I said, it takes on the taste of whatever you cook it with. I know when KFC a few years back had a massive chicken shortage, corn just turned around and went, yeah, we can provide you. Obviously they didn't take it up on it because it wouldn't have been proper chicken, but they can produce it in massive quantities. So as a protein source, it makes sense to be using this a lot more. Yeah, you can use it to produce meat. I've actually seen recently what they've started doing is using various techniques, either from mycoproteins or from other sources. They've actually used 3D printers that have been modified. So they've actually been printing meats. And because they can print the fibres in the same way that your muscle fibres line up, they've been producing meats that looks and tastes and has the same texture as meat out there by 3D printing these layers of different fibres. See, I don't mind it, Capri. I don't mind it at all. Depending on how it's cooked, it can be actually quite nice. So, yeah, it's just one of those things to bear in mind. I can see in the future, if we do end up with lots and lots of land issues, where we physically can't grow enough foods on the land to feed the population, this is something, because it can literally be done in a food factory, in an industrial scale, we don't need the land. So it's just something to consider. If you think it's nasty, you're obviously not cooking it right. Right. I'm not veggie, by the way, but I do quite like vegetarian food. Now, something just to have a quick look at before we finish. And I'm going to drop these questions into Google Classroom for you guys to have a look at. So just want to quickly skim through and show you some examples of some exam questions that goes with it. So this first one starts looking at deforestation in Asia. And what they're looking at is this particular island, just getting you to make a comparison. Now, lots of students don't answer these, and there's no reason at all not to answer it, because realistically, it's just saying, what can you see in this diagram? And that's the fact that there is an increase in deforestation around the edges, which is the main thing that actually they want you to go for this one, okay? So that's the first thing that we're going to need to have a look at. 2 seconds, let me just bring this up. There we go. So, possible reasons that we could be putting down for this one then. Well, actually, all of those ones I said before for deforestation, increased farming, quarrying, producing fuel, space for crops, 2 bullet points. You don't need to write a sentence, don't need to write a paragraph, just put them in there. And that'll get you the marks for it. Negative effects on the ecosystem, well, we've looked at that, loss of habitat, loss of biodiversity, increased carbon dioxide production, less photosynthesis, global warming, any of those will give you the marks for that one. So realistically, bullet point all the way through. We don't need sentences on that one. You're not going to lose any marks for it. Again, another data question. There will be data questions coming up. Around about a third of your science GCSEs will be based on data at some point. So we need to make sure that actually we get good at looking at data. We get good at analysing graphs. Not just in biology, but in chemistry and physics as well. Even more so in physics, where you've got lots more calculations. But this one, again, doesn't need any science knowledge. It just says, describe the trends you can see. And what we're looking at is actually peat compost, the levels used, remains fairly constant between 1999 and 2005. But from 2005 to 2009, the amount decreased, whereas the amount of peat-free compost rapidly increased from 1999 through to 2009. That's it. That's literally just what it's saying. We can just go through and put the trends in there. What effect does the destruction of peat bogs have on the gases? Increased carbon dioxide. Yeah, there shouldn't be anything different with any of this. Deforestation, describe one effect to ecosystem. Reduced biodiversity, reduced habitats, disruption of food chains. Less resilience within the food webs. Those are the sorts of things they're asking you to put in. Now, when we started looking at water quality and biodiversity, so my wife used to work for the Environment Agency, and one of the things they would do would be looking at the water quality of different areas. And one of the ways that you can judge the quality of the water and how good it is to actually go through and look at the nymphs and the different invertebrates, because different invertebrates will only live in certain areas. Okay, so it's a really, really good indicator of the water quality. Now, as we start having a look at this one, we can start seeing actually some of the clues are in the names here. Mayfly nymphs generally like really, really high quality water. Okay, so if we have mayfly nymphs and caddisfly larvae nymphs, then generally speaking, we know that the water quality is going to be pretty good. There you go, I'll put my mug back up there again for a minute for you. Okay, so that's one of the things to consider. When we start getting around to the bloodworm, these will generally, they live in most things, but they prefer more polluted water. So if we're looking at stream X and stream Y, we can actually then work out that actually stream Y is going to be lots more polluted because of the species we have generally only found in polluted areas. Whereas when we look at stream X, it's less pollution because we've got these nymphs and the freshwater shrimp. Now, they give us more information. So you didn't have to know about the particular species, just the fact that the invertebrates themselves form a really, really good indicator. So we can then come through and we can actually use our knowledge and the information given here to identify this. So you shouldn't need to know any science to get some really good marks on that one. Sewage works. I'm just flicking through. I'm not going to go through these now because actually I want you to have a go at home. Okay, so change in water quality. There's been a leak. That's the main thing that we have to worry about. Change in water quality, we go down. Concentration of dissolved oxygen high to start with. We get a massive decrease there. So this is where the sewage overflowed and we got the leak. We can then go through and we can start having a look at the sort of the water quality and the amount of these species that are found in this particular area. So let's have a quick look. Sludge worms increase, decrease. So this is when it would have been the most polluted. Then the bloodworms increase, so we've got less pollution now. And we can sort of go back up to our table to help us with this one. So bloodworm and water louse, medium pollution. So we've got an increase here, which means we've got less pollution. And then we've got the water lice coming in and the mayfly nymphs indicating that the water quality has improved. So describing the pattern, those are the bullet points we're looking at putting in. By the way, the microorganisms present in the sewage, it's because microorganisms will break down the sludge in sewage via respiration, which means they're going to be using up the oxygen to do that, which is why we get that drop in oxygen as we're looking at it. 3 ways in which large-scale deforestation has increased, exactly the same as before. We're reducing photosynthesis. We're just destroying habitat, purely on carbon dioxide. Chopping down trees, which means they're going to be burnt. They're also going to decay. As they decay, carbon dioxide is being produced by the by the detritivores and the decomposers, and we have the reduction in carbon dioxide. Why do we get a reduction in biodiversity? Because we get less habitat, so species are dying. Okay, I'm not going to go through anything else. Here we go. Fish farm. This is what I was talking about before. Massive cages in the water. So it's still out in the ocean, so the water's still coming through. But because the fish are not free to moving, they're not burning off as much energy, so they get bigger and they require less food. I'm going to put these questions into the Google Classroom after this, so that you can go through, wrong one, that one, so that you can actually go through and answer them and have a go at them. And what I'll probably do is set them as an assignment so we can go through and mark them afterwards. I may even go through some of the answers to that on Friday. We'll see how much time we've got. 5 minutes longer than usual, so 50 minutes this one. I've been trying to sort of keep them to around about 45 minutes. As always, I'm going to jump onto Google Meet in a few minutes. So if you can give me 2 to 3 minutes, refresh Google Classroom and the Meet link will be in there. Enjoy the rest of your day if I don't see you in a minute, but it'd be good to see as many of you as possible make it onto the Google Meet. Take care.